Belief is the enemy of knowing.
All right, man. Welcome to Crow 777 Radio. This is hour one of episode 644. This will be a two-parter. Jason and I are covering music. If you consider what we call culture in the West, or even just our life experience, and then try to calculate in your mind how much of that is colored, fashioned, tinged, shadowed, however you want to say it, by entertainment or media of one kind or another, it's actually quite astonishing when you begin to think about it. And what got me thinking about this was the idea that when radio came online, the variety of our world began to reduce, because all of a sudden, all these unique people with supposedly unique looks and unique genes and unique abilities were all doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. And as radio came and film came, more so to the point where in the part of the world where I live, culture is driven by entertainment, basically. But anyhow, welcome, Jason.
And a pleasant good morning.
I'm kind of frustrated. I set up the scope this morning, and it's been 3 weeks since I've had an opportunity to shoot because of weather. And I got a whopping hour before the wind kicked up so high that I just couldn't pull it off anymore. It's been I can't even tell you how difficult it's been to try to get solar footage.
Well, we're almost in September here, and that means in Louisiana, it's just hot instead of ungodly hot.
Will your humidity fall off in September?
Maybe a little.
Well, that's what happens here. It's already happened. We're already in fall weather, and this could be the best filming opportunities of the year, but this weather has not been cooperating. But with that, is there anything you want to say about the music notes you wrote before we jump into it?
I seem to say this an awful lot, but every time I've researched these topics these days, I find myself learning so much more than I ever thought I would.
It's kind of astonishing that it's taken all these decades for people to start to clue in about the reality of things like the Beatles and other things. And the problem is that we love it so much that even after we're aware of certain things, we still kind of deny it. This was true when we brought up John Coleman, is that his name? The Committee of 300 book.
Dr. John Coleman.
Yeah, he outed things, and people like Fortune actually said, no, I know this for a fact. Firsthand, I know this for a fact, a number of the things. But what I was then told is even the things that you couldn't verify, it was pointed out to me, it doesn't matter because it happened. So you don't need anyone to tell you because you know this occurred. But with that, let's jump in. Let's kick off part one of music, the decades of music.
To start off with our discussion of the changing of the decades in the 20th and the 21st centuries from a musical standpoint, we will begin with what music had been in the 19th century. Much of that music was, of course, classical. Classical music in what is called the Romantic era, which lasted from approximately 1800 to 1910, emphasized emotion, individualism, and dramatic expression, which was a move away from the classical era's more formal structures, which would have been in the previous century. The classical era is said to have begun around 1750 and lasting into the early 1800s. Composers in the Romantic era, however, wrote more expansive symphonies, operas, and piano works, often being inspired by nature, nationalism, or personal struggles. The Romantic era's musical focus on melody and drama would go on to influence later popular music forms, especially film scores in the 20th century and beyond. Some other musical experiences at this time would also have been folk, minstrel shows, opera, parlor music, and, of course, hymns.
And to me, what this refers to is complexity. A lot of it, not all of it, but a good part of it. I would urge people to go look up, just do a quick, even a Wikipedia search to learn a little bit about an orchestra, how many parts there are, what the sections are, brass, woodwind, strings, so on, and look at the complexity. I did this not too long ago, and I think I remember reading that some orchestras had over 100 people. The complexity of the music, if you look at the sheet music after it's been transcribed and compared it to things that are going on now, they're not even in the same universe. What would you say, Jason, if you compare back at this time, all the orchestral and what we call classical that still holds up to this day, what grabs you the most? For me, it's the complexity.
Their ability to capture emotion and the rises and falls of those emotional states throughout the particular pieces. What's interesting is there still was very simple music being written and being performed and all that. But then you had these certain literal genius people like a Mozart or a Beethoven, a Bach, a Haydn, writing these insanely incredible pieces of music that just to this day can't be touched.
It's funny you mentioned that. I saw a Ritchie Blackmore interview not too long ago. For those of you that don't know, Ritchie Blackmore was probably one of the top-level skilled guitarists of early rock and roll, hard rock. And Smoke on the Water, everyone knows that song. I saw him in an interview say that he wrote that because he'd listened to Beethoven's Fifth and inverted it. And so their biggest song was pulled from a simple inversion of an old Beethoven song. But the other thing that strikes me when I think back on these classical names that you've mentioned is they're like professionals. Like if you look at an orchestra, you get the sense that every person holding an instrument is a professional. In the same way, a skilled carpenter would be brought on to do, high-end furniture, that kind of thing. There was a lot of knowledge and there was a lot of music history and theory, even at that time, that was incorporated into all that. But let's keep moving along here.
The phonograph, later called a gramophone, and changing again in the 1940s to a record player, and more recently than that, a turntable, is a device for the mechanical and analog reproduction of sound. The sound vibration waveforms are recorded as corresponding physical deviations of a helical or spiral groove that is engraved, etched, incised, or impressed into the surface of a rotating cylinder or disc that is known as a record and later as vinyl. The phonograph was first invented in 1877 by Thomas Edison. On January 6, 1877, Thomas Edison successfully recorded and played back his voice reciting "Mary Had a Little Lamb" at his Menlo Park laboratory in New Jersey, which was the first instance of a recorded sound in human history. The phonograph was initially dubbed the talking machine, and it caused a sensation, earning Thomas Edison the nickname the Wizard of Menlo Park. It was demonstrated publicly in 1878, where it astonished audiences who had, of course, never heard recorded sound before. Alexander Graham Bell's Volta Laboratory would go on to make several improvements to the phonograph in the 1880s and would introduce the graphophone, which included the use of wax-coated cardboard cylinders and a cutting stylus that moved from side to side in a zigzag groove around the record. In the 1890s, Emil Berliner initiated the transition from phonograph cylinders to flat discs with a spiral groove running from the periphery to near the center, coining the term gramophone for disc record players. Later improvements through the years would include modifications to the turntable and its drive system, the stylus, its pickup system, and the sound and equalization systems. The disc phonograph record was the dominant commercial audio distribution format throughout most of the 20th century, and phonographs became the first example of an audio reproduction system that people could easily own and use at their leisure in their own homes. The invention of the phonograph in the late 19th century would have profound effects on how music would be consumed by people until much later in the 20th century.
Profound effects is like it falls so short. Who would have imagined back in the late 1800s when this was invented, or the earliest versions, that this very thing would be implemented in the late 50s and early 60s to not only take over, but control the baby boom generation, which was massive and which had it in their minds that they were tired of how the world was going and truly wanted to make changes. It was entertainment, it was music, and it was this device that allowed the psychological operations that we're so familiar with to be delivered everywhere all the time.
And the phonograph would be one of the key things, not the only thing, but one of the key huge things that would feed the beast that would become the music industry. They would make so much money making records that I'm surprised they didn't try and find a way to keep it around longer, although it does have a bit of a fan base even to this day.
Yeah, I think that it goes without saying that even with the pops and scratches, it sounds much more, I don't know, rich or full or something than a CD recording. And the other thing is you've got to realize a lot of those turntables back in the day were on belts. So the speed at which they play back might have been somewhat dependent on your device. But the thing about the album, the LP, the 12-inch disc, and that big sleeve with all the artwork and information is you really can't explain the impact that it had on the 60s, 70s, even the 80s. It was overwhelming. There was almost not a cultural component of the younger generations in this country that weren't tied, particularly in the 60s and early 70s, to the artwork and everything you could learn from the sleeve of that album. And I'm with you. It's amazing that they let that fall by the wayside, because as soon as it shrunk into CD form, the artwork and everything there became much less important. But as we now know, there were forces far above the record companies that had plans.
Well, buying an album in a lot of cases, when you're talking about 60s and 70s rock especially, was kind of an experience. You'd put the record on and you'd be looking at the artwork and you'd be combing through all the insides, especially if it was one of the ones that opened up and there was a lot of stuff in there. Sometimes things came with it. I know the Beatles started doing shtick like that, where they were including things in the packaging. So it was an experience to buy an album.
It was absolutely an experience. And the artwork and everything that went into it became iconic at a level that we don't really remember now. As an example, what you also pointed out was when you had an album, you put on side one, you started with song one. And most of the albums at a certain point were put together in a way that you were intended to listen to it in an order. And that's how you get very famous albums like, say, The Wall by Pink Floyd, which is kind of telling a story, or supposedly the rock opera from The Who called Tommy. And then you have people like David Gilmour, as we reached into the digital era, that sued to prevent them from breaking up the arrangement, where he had put this song comes first, this one next. For a while, I don't know if it's still going on, he wouldn't allow single songs to be bought out because he felt it cheapened the experience that they had put together.
I would tend to agree with him.
So would I. It was a very different world. It was an experience, but under it all, it was driving the backbeat of culture, film, and everything that goes with it in this country.
The 20th century dawns, and the 1900s and 1910s are upon us, which is often referred to as the dawn of recorded music. This period sees the transition from live performances and the use of sheet music as the primary means of music consumption to the revolutionary advent of recorded sound, which is being driven by the wondrous invention of the phonograph and its later successors. This era's new musical styles sees ragtime, early jazz, vaudeville, and Tin Pan Alley pop dominating the soundscape. Ragtime is a syncopated, piano-driven genre that is rooted in African American musical traditions and features lively, rhythmic melodies that would often be played in dance halls or parlors. Its structured yet playful sound acted as a bridge from classical to popular music. Key figures include Scott Joplin, called the King of Ragtime, who composed iconic pieces like Maple Leaf Rag in 1899, but was still popular into the 1900s, as well as The Entertainer in 1902. His works were widely distributed via sheet music and early recordings. Other ragtime composers included James Scott and Joseph Lamb, who contributed to the genre's popularity. Ragtime's syncopation and rhythmic energy directly influenced early jazz, and its accessibility made it a commercial success through the sales of sheet music and piano rolls.
People often overlook, Fortune was the one who told me the value of sheet music within the recording, which we don't even care about anymore, but it was a big deal back in the day. But some of this music has legs. We're talking about the early 1900s. Jason mentioned Joplin and The Entertainer. That song comes back full force in, I don't know, 74, something like that. for a movie called The Sting, which had the two A-listers of Hollywood on it. I think it probably won Academy Awards, but it culturally echoed around the world again. But if we look at when the shift happened, what Jason's pointing out here, someday when you're bored, go to a search engine and look up the number one song for each year from 1920 forward, and you'll be stunned what starts to happen in the 50s.
Early jazz begins emerging in the 1910s and is particularly associated with the city of New Orleans and is considered a groundbreaking musical form that laid the foundation for one of the most influential genres of the 20th century. Jazz is described as blending African American spirituals, blues, and ragtime styles, along with improvisational elements, which were performed by small ensembles in venues like bars and brothels. What we are seeing at this time is a transition from the structured, notated music that had been the norm to a freer, more expressive style that would define the jazz age that would be coming in the following decade. Unlike the more structured compositions of ragtime or classical music, early jazz emphasized spontaneous creation, with musicians improvising melodies and embellishments, often with performances varying from one night to the next. Improvisation is said to have been rooted in African American oral traditions, which allowed performers to express individuality within a collective framework. Early jazz inherited ragtime's syncopated rhythms, with accents coming on offbeats, but loosened them into a more fluid, swinging feel. This swing would become a hallmark of jazz that would create a sense of forward momentum. Polyrhythms that were derived from African musical traditions layered multiple rhythms, which gave the music an infectious energy. Early jazz ensembles, particularly those in the New Orleans area, practiced collective improvisation, where multiple instruments, such as the cornet, clarinet, and trombone, improvised simultaneously, weaving melodies and counter-melodies around a central theme. New Orleans, as a port city, had a unique blend of African American, Creole, French, Spanish, and Caribbean cultures, and is considered the cradle of early jazz.
And everybody knows to this day that New Orleans musically is a melting pot, and it's been admired for a long time. But interestingly enough, if I'm not mistaken, I want to say it was Henry Ford who made public statements about how low-minded and terrible jazz was, and it was looked down on. And it's kind of funny that someone at that high station of controlling society would have such an opinion, because what this is doing is breaking all the rules, breaking all the boundaries. We don't read the sheet music and tap out a time and hit our quarter notes exactly. We improvise night after night after night, where you might have a band play for a week and not play the same song as similar to the night before, each new playing. You know, Jason, another band that I think we could kind of point to is the Grateful Dead seems to have kind of taken this idea on, if I'm not mistaken.
They did. They absolutely improvised quite a bit.
They had the huge following called the Deadheads, and as we've mentioned so many times, they were shown to have been on the payroll of FBI or whoever it was. But setting that aside, there was a huge black market in the tapes that were made at Dead concerts for this very reason, because they were improvising night after night, which meant that there would be songs that were recorded which were unique and considered the best of the best.
Even the early years of Pink Floyd were a bit like that, although not quite to the extent that the Dead did it.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you're right on the money. It seems a little more experimental to me, almost spacey a little bit.
Yeah, I actually like finding old Pink Floyd recordings of their concerts, which for the longest time I didn't know pretty much every show they ever played was recorded. Now they're bootlegs, as in like somebody in the audience recorded it, but most of them are perfectly listenable. And I'm hearing shows that took place before I was born that I thought I would never hear and had been lost to time.
Funny how they knew to record it all.
Tin Pan Alley Pop is another significant music genre of the time, with the name Tin Pan Alley referring to a collection of music publishers and songwriters in New York City that originally referred to a specific location on West 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues in the Flower District of Manhattan. The start of Tin Pan Alley is usually dated to around 1885, when a number of music publishers set up shop in the same district of Manhattan. The first one to begin the era is said to be Willis Whitmark, who was the founder of one of the first publishing houses to concentrate on popular over religious or classical sheet music when he moved to the 28th Street location from Manhattan's entertainment district. The end of Tin Pan Alley is less clear-cut, with some dating it to the start of the Great Depression in the 1930s, although the style did continue on. Tin Pan Alley pop is characterized by its melodic and often sentimental songs that were frequently written for sheet music distribution, as well as for performance in various venues like music halls, vaudeville, and even early film. The musical style incorporated elements of ragtime, blues, and jazz, evolving to become a dominant force in American popular music for quite a few years. There are conflicting explanations about the origins of the term Tin Pan Alley, with the most popular account being that it was originally a derogatory reference that was made by Monroe H. Rosenfeld in the New York Herald, saying that it was the collective sound being made by so many cheap upright pianos that were all playing different tunes, which was reminiscent of the banging of tin pans in an alleyway.
I always thought it was, the beggar's cup. I thought that's how it got his name. Who knows? But here you're pointing out that at this period of time, the printed sheet music had value. And you would be astonished to know how much money certain people made off the publishing. Back then, when you were talking about the publishing, this is what you were talking about, the sheet music. Now, when I was young must have been the summer of 6th grade, I think, when I picked up the guitar for the first time, sheet music was still a thing. Within the course of me learning to play guitar and the time I got into my first band, so the late 70s, probably 77, 78, already the value or the importance of sheet music was beginning to fall away because there was a new thing coming along called tab. When you started playing, Jason, was sheet music still in the mix?
Yeah, sheet music still existed, and tablature was probably the predominant thing, I would say.
Which probably doesn't happen without guitars. When I think of tablature, it's wholly because of the guitar was so popular.
Guitar and bass, yeah.
Yeah.
To their credit, I think pretty much all official books of songs and albums of popular music will have the actual sheet music with the tablature.
There's a funny thing. So when the sheet music was still big, you could go to like a music store and there would be a book with, say, Led Zeppelin's whole album in sheet music. But the funny thing was, it was never the music that you heard on the album. It was like for someone to sit down at piano and play a roundabout version of whatever song they were doing. And it was at about that time that the magazines like Guitar Magazine and other things started to introduce tab. At least that's how I found it. And when tab came to be, that became the sheet music of the rock and roll generation and pulled it forward, teaching people how to play that way.
I believe it was Guitar for the Practicing Musician that was the big magazine of that era. Might still be. I haven't bought them in many, many years.
Well, I remember too, the one you mentioned, there was another one. It might even been called Guitar, but then there was Circus Magazine, which wasn't really music centric, more rock and roll centric.
Vaudeville and music hall were also musical categories that were prominent in the 1900s and 1910s, which were vibrant and variety-based entertainment forms that played a critical role in shaping early 20th century popular music and performance culture. These theatrical formats, which were characterized by diverse acts that included music, comedy, dance, and novelty performances, were the dominant live entertainment for urban audiences before the rise of cinema and radio. Known more as vaudeville in the United States and music hall in the United Kingdom, this style featured a series of unrelated acts that typically lasted 10 to 20 minutes each and were performed in a single show. Acts included singers, comedians, dancers, magicians, acrobats, jugglers, animal acts, and more. Shows were designed to appeal to broad audiences, offering something for everyone, such as sentimental ballads for older patrons, ragtime songs for younger crowds, and comedy for families. Vaudeville was known for its clean entertainment and avoided controversial or risque content to attract middle and working class families, unlike earlier, rowdier music halls.
Vaudeville has a huge effect on American culture that I don't think a lot of people know. If you go back and look at some of the big golden age actors, they either come directly from vaudeville or they have families that were vaudeville. But even the early black and white programs, so many of them were what were called variety shows. And to me, I think that must have come from vaudeville, where you'd watch a program like Ed Sullivan, and it would be one act after the other, an animal act, a musical act, someone doing tricks. I mean, don't you think that had to be a throwback, right, Jason?
I would think so. Even something like Johnny Carson's late night show was very derivative of that, I would think.
Yeah, exactly. Because he had evolved to the point, for lack of a better word, where he was having the popular guests and he was gatekeeping, of course. That chair, he controlled that chair, and that chair controlled a lot who was on his show. You can go back and look at the first time Seinfeld or anyone else got their big break and got on Johnny Carson. But as Jason's pointing out, they take a break for an act all the time. As a matter of fact, Johnny Carson is often doing comedy skits, and that's a direct throwback to vaudeville, I would estimate.
The 1920s rolls in, which will be dubbed as the Jazz Age by American novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, and also known as the Roaring Twenties. Jazz music is evolving from its 1910s roots in New Orleans, expanding into a national as well as international phenomenon. Three subgenres of jazz develop. The first is Dixieland, or New Orleans jazz, which features small ensembles that could consist of cornet, clarinet, trombone, piano, banjo, drums, along with collective improvisation that created a lively and polyphonic sound. Songs like Tiger Rag by the original Dixieland Jazz Band that had been recorded in 1917 but was quite popular in the 1920s exemplifies its energetic style. The second one is hot jazz, which is emphasized with virtuosic solo improvisation and was led by pioneers like Louis Armstrong. His Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings, like West End Blues from 1928, showcased expressive trumpet solos and scat singing, which shifted jazz toward individual artistry. Lastly, there was big band sweet jazz. This comes later in the decade, and larger orchestras like Paul Whiteman's would play arranged, danceable jazz that had less improvisation. Whiteman's Rhapsody in Blue from 1924, that was composed by George Gershwin, blended jazz with classical elements. Jazz's rhythmic freedom and expressiveness redefined what was popular music and would influence swing, bebop, and later genres like rock and roll. Its popularity via rising technologies like radio and records made it a global phenomenon.
And from my eye, when you go back and look at things like we're looking at here in the 1920s, when you roll forward, you can see the social engineering through the music all day long. In the 1920s, Jason just listed off what was going on in the musical areas, but this was in every city. There were thousands of places where skilled musicians made their living playing every night, whether it be jazz or something else, all the way up into the 50s, even maybe to the end of the 50s, when that started to die because of rock and roll, which to me shows the social engineering. These are skilled musicians that have been trained or trained themselves that could sit down, grab a piece of sheet music, and play it. This was going on all over the country. It was commonplace. If you went out to dinner back in this time, there was almost certainly a band there. But I wonder if people who lived the 1920s looked back in the 40s and said that was the last good decade, as we do now. Jason and I look back and I see the 80s as the last fully good decade, with the 90s not the front runner, but still in the game. That's what the 20s is. You've got to realize by the time we get to 1933, everything, because of social engineering, goes to hell in a handbasket. And they make movies like Seabiscuit and other things just to show you what was done. and they leave it in limbo for 10 years or something like that. And all of a sudden, help is on the way with the CCC and all the building projects. And suddenly someone cares and people can have work again. It's all social engineering. But to look back at the 20s, to me, Jason, it almost feels like the 20s was one of the last fully free decades.
And maybe it was because the horrors of World War II are going to start building up pretty much right after this.
Yeah, spot on. And you've got to realize by the 20s, they've already done the massive fall that no one thinks about anymore, that almost never gets mentioned, that people like Steiner wrote about, World War I, and how the world changed irreparably. And now when I look back, I would mark World War I as the beginning, as the actual beginning of the modern effort to take over to the world. And as we look at the music scene in the 20s, it sure feels like maybe that was the pinnacle of free, go for it America decade.
Another major category of music that is coming into its own in the 1920s is blues. While there is no exact date when blues came about, it is thought that it got its start in the late 19th century, probably between the 1870s and 1890s. However, it was not named or recorded until the early 20th century and began gaining prominence throughout the 1910s. Blues began to form in rural, southern African American communities where they blended spirituals, work songs, and field hollers with instruments like guitar or banjo for accompaniment. Oral histories that came from musicians like W.C. Handy suggests that blues-like music was performed by the 1890s in the Mississippi Delta and other regions. This period represents the proto-blues phase, where the genre's musical and lyrical elements coalesced, but lacked any sort of formal recognition. From there, throughout the 1900s to 1910s, elements of the blues began appearing in early jazz in the New Orleans area, indicating its influence on related genres. The musical structure of blues music was the 12-bar blues form, a 12-bar progression typically using 3 chords, the 1, 4, and 5 in a pattern. It also used A-A-B lyrical structure where the first line is sung twice, followed by a contrasting line. It also used what were called blue notes, which were flattened or bent notes, such as the 3rd, 5th, and 7th, which gave blues its melancholic and soulful sound that was derived from African tonal traditions. These notes created a distinctive, expressive quality that set blues apart from other genres. Another aspect of blues was the call and response, which is rooted in spirituals and often featured vocal phrases that would be answered by instruments, like the guitar or piano, creating a conversational feel. Blues lyrics were narrative-driven, addressing universal themes like love, heartbreak, hardship, and betrayal, often with a mix of humor, irony, or resilience. They reflected African American experiences, which would include topics like migration, poverty, and racism, but were all thought of as broadly relatable. Several subgenres of blues emerged. The first is classic blues, which was predominant throughout the 1920s and featured female vocalists backed by jazz ensembles. The second was country blues, emerging later in the decade, which featured solo male performers with acoustic guitar or harmonica and emphasized raw, unpolished sounds. The last was piano blues, with pianists using boogie-woogie rhythms which would influence later blues styles. The influence that blues music would have on later musical styles, as well as Western culture overall, cannot be overstated.
No, it cannot. And the degree to which it was used to socially engineer, in my view, also cannot be overstated. Back then, when blues was coming to the forefront, people like Ford or any of the classical musicians looked at this as very lowbrow. Didn't take that much skill. That was their idea for it. But you've got to realize that what we're looking at here is the foundation for rock and roll. And rock and roll changes the world. I mean, changes the world in a big, big way. But the social engineering can be seen through the blues. If you go back to our older episodes where I tell you I don't accept that Robert Johnson was a living human being, he was a character developed I even suspected they were trying to write him out of the timeline of rock and replace him with a man named Charlie Patton. But to be honest, I don't pay enough attention anymore. So I don't know if that's happened or it hasn't. But what I can tell you is I took the time to take apart a blues standard, which is ubiquitous for the rock generation, and that is the Crossroad Blues. And I decode the language there to show you what is going on. So the idea of the devil gets hooked into the blues very early on, and this gravitates into rock and roll. But in early rock and roll, America was not ready for that kind of thing. It was not as open as it is today. And as time went on, it became more acceptable. By the time we get the Beatles' biggest album, or one of their biggest albums, certainly the most popular album artwork, Sgt. Pepper's, you have their hero in the number 2 spot on the album jacket, which is Aleister Crowley. So you can see the engineering teeing up for a genre called rock, which will change the world. And by the way, all those big, they used to call them gunslingers, or what do they call them, Jason? All the musicians they hired to play on albums because they were so talented.
The Wrecking Crew. They were session musicians.
Yeah, they called them gunslingers, something like a gunslinger, but the Wrecking Crew was one of them. The studio where Leonard Skinner, Muscle Shoals, had one of those bands in there that was actually playing, and people didn't realize it wasn't the band they loved. But the point I'm making is those were the people, those skilled musicians, which were the gunslingers that were pulled in on recording albums. Many of them viewed the onset of rock as you didn't need a lot of skill to do it. That was the view they took then. Then there was a younger generation that came after them that was much more into the genre after it had been established.
From what I understand, especially with the Wrecking Crew, but Muscle Shoals is another great example, and there are others. Motown had a lot of high-end players. A lot of what people were hearing back then were the same musicians over and over and over again, and they didn't even realize it because of the pretty faces on the album covers.
Well, what's astonishing is, like, when you think about it, people got mad because they thought it was their favorite rock band playing, when in fact, when they hit the studio, it was studio musicians, the best of the best. They could sit down, look at a piece of music, and play it instantly. As a matter of fact, for those old enough to remember Glenn Campbell, he was a member of the Wrecking Crew, but he was also pretty. So what Glenn Campbell did is he translated his work in the studios to become a rock star himself. I would urge you, go to YouTube and look up Glenn Campbell playing guitar. The man has some chops. But to get back to the point, they were mad that they weren't told the truth about who was playing, but the argument was, well, studio time costs hundreds of dollars an hour, and we can't wait for someone to get it right, which is probably true. But what you don't realize is so many of the iconic songs that you hear were not written by the band. It was one of those studio musicians who put the iconic hook or something else, and they were never credited.
The 1920s saw economic prosperity, and this, along with urban growth, fueled demand for entertainment. Broadway, which is centered in New York's theater district, was attracting middle and upper-class audiences who were seeking glamour and excitement. Broadway was being influenced by New York City's immigrant communities, such as Jewish, Irish, and Italian, all adding in their distinctive cultural flavors. Prohibition, which outlawed alcohol from 1920 to 1933, was driving audiences to Broadway theaters as legal entertainment alternatives to what were called speakeasies, which were underground bars and clubs where alcohol was being served, and one would have to be in on the secret to gain admittance. Broadway was embracing jazz's syncopation and improvisational spirit, with composers like George Gershwin incorporating jazz rhythms and bluesy melodies. This fusion distinguished 1920s Broadway from the earlier 19th century's operettas and early 20th century's ragtime-influenced shows. Dance was central to Broadway performances, with jazz-inspired routines like the Charleston and tap dance energizing shows. Choreographers like Ned Wayburn were pioneering precision dance lines, and lavish sets, costumes, and lighting created a sense of spectacle, which appealed to audiences who were seeking escapism.
Escapism indeed, and they're going to need it big at the end of this period of time. 1920 to 33, we were told you weren't allowed to have alcohol. That's interesting. They crashed the economy intentionally, from my point of view, in 1929. And magically, a couple of years later, you can drink again. Maybe it'll help them weather the downtrodden status everyone's been put in, because magically $100 million just disappeared over a couple of days. Don't ask me where it goes. If we had a world where we spent money, it wouldn't be possible for, if you had a pocket full of gold, for that to disappear. But as you can see, in 29, literally wealth disappears, or at least that's how it's explained. But to look at what's going on here, the theater is a big deal, and it affects culture, and the things get chosen to run and be the big deal that go over and over or have a long runtime. That too affects culture. And I will maintain till the end of my days, there was never a time in the history we know about, and probably the one we don't, where the ruling class knew exactly the value of theater vis-a-vis influencing the masses.
The stock market crash of 1929, which is also known as the Great Crash or Black Tuesday, was a catastrophic event that marked the end of the prosperous Roaring Twenties. It triggered a worldwide economic downturn that is known as the Great Depression. It began on October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, when panic selling led to a sharp drop in stock prices on the New York Stock Exchange. The situation would worsen over the following days, culminating on October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, when over 16 million shares were traded in a single day, which wiped out billions in market value. This crash was said to have been fueled by several factors, keeping in mind that there were numerous robber barons at play at this time, which included speculative stock buying on margin or borrowing money to invest, overproduction in industries, unequal wealth distribution, and a lack of regulatory oversight on Wall Street. While the crash itself was actually brief, its effects rippled through the economy, leading to widespread bank failures, business closures, and a loss of confidence in the financial system. This had a massive social effect and would change the kind of musical listening that many people engaged in.
You know, since we're talking about music here, I mean, consider what we're saying. Earlier, I mentioned that there were literally thousands of musical venues, from where you go to have dinner to nightclubs, just thousands of them in every city across this country. When this happens, think about the number. It's like 2020. How many businesses went out of business? How many came back? As we know from our recent experience, which probably doesn't even approach, well, actually it does approach, because they shut everything down. My point being, everything changed, and everybody who's living now knows the change that just happened in the 20s. In 2020, isn't it interesting that this happened in the 20s, at the end of the 20s, and we're talking 2020. But the 1920s were prosperous beyond imagining by many accounts. And all of a sudden, the rug gets pulled. But if you go back and you take a careful look, this is engineered. How is it that almost 10 years go by where people are just in the dirt, scrounging for bread, literally having soup lines and bread lines, and all of a sudden, magically, a president decides he cares and makes all these public works and the CCC and all the other things that happen? We're going to build things, bridges and buildings and just everything all over the place. All of a sudden, everyone's got work again. But what was lost is very similar, in my view, Jason, to what happened in 2020. Our landscape and how business works and everything else changed on a dime after 2020, to include, do you remember before 2020, there were some businesses that delivered and many did not? As soon as 2020 established, every business delivered. And where I am, it's noticeable, but it never stopped. For some reason, there was no budget for delivery before this happened, but now there is. And it just goes to show you the manipulations that change the lay of the land.
And to finish off hour one more very important thing to mention before we move on to the 1930s is the invention and propagation of the technology of radio. Radio's origins began in the later 1800s as scientific experiments with electromagnetic waves, where it would evolve from theoretical physics to practical wireless communication. The first commercial radio station, KDKA, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, launched on November 2nd, 1920, and broadcast the U.S. presidential election results. This event is widely regarded as the birth of commercial radio broadcasting. KDKA soon expanded to include music and sports, as well as religious programs. By 1922, over 500 stations were licensed in the U.S., and companies like the Radio Corporation of America, commonly known as RCA, began mass-producing affordable radios. Similarly, in the UK, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, was founded in 1922, starting regular music broadcasts. Technological advancements, such as electrical recording in 1925, improved broadcast quality, which allowed the clearer transmission of music. Also by 1925, over 5 million U.S. households now owned radios, tuning into broadcasts of live jazz from venues like Chicago's Lincoln Gardens or Harlem's Cotton Club. Radio boosted genres like hot jazz, such as Louis Armstrong's broadcasts, and created stars through live performances. It synergized with phonographs, since listeners were hearing songs on the air and subsequently bought the records, which fueled the music industry's growth. Tin Pan Alley songs gained airplay, while early country music appeared on stations like WLS Chicago's National Barn Dance around 1924. Radio amplified the Great Migration's cultural spread, making jazz a national phenomenon. The 1929 stock market crash made radio almost essential, as it was free entertainment during the hardships that many people were now dealing with. Ownership of radio units surged to 60% of U.S. households by the year 1934. The golden age of radio, considered to be from the 1930s until the 1950s, would feature live swing bands like Benny Goodman and singers that came to be called crooners, such as Bing Crosby. Also offered escapism. From there, radio was the most common form of mainstream entertainment until television comes along to give it some serious competition. But this wouldn't be until the 1950s. Radio would still have a lot of dominance for many decades, only really facing issues once the internet took over so much with communication technologies.
One thing we had not lost yet as radio came online was our moral values and the family unit. These things were still pretty much intact. If you go back and you look at the early call signs, KDKA, well, that's a kind of a weird 911 encode, but everybody's heard of RCA. And RCA was a bit like the Amazon, or it got to be places like General Electric, RCA, Westinghouse. But the thing is, in the same way, they always knew the power of theater. They knew darn well the power of this. It's even illustrated in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, where the incumbent senator is going to a radio station and his kind of dim-witted son sees people and says, we need to go over there and politic and press the flesh. The senator hits his son and says, you idiot, we're not oneing or twoing, we're mass communicating. And they make a joke out of it. But think about what I opened up with saying. All these unique lives, supposedly unique DNA, unique skills, unique look and feel to each of us. And radio comes along, and what happens? We all begin to experience the exact same thing at the exact same time. But there's another thing that we got with radio. And for anyone who wants to go read the book, The Invisible Rainbow, I can't imagine a better scientific outing of what occurred and demonstrative with evidence of what occurred. We got a thing that began to be normalized called the flu. This came once when electricity came, and there was another version of it when radio hit. The first time I was aware of this was years ago. And in San Diego, where I used to live, there was a mall not too far where I was in Lemon Grove called College Grove. As you pull out of that shopping center, there's an abutment near this big field that used to have antennas on it. And it says the first global or worldwide radio, early 1900s, earlier than you would think. I don't remember the exact date. But with this technology and the power it gives people to communicate and influence society, also came the flu. And I think that people need to read this book, The Invisible Rainbow, if for no other reason, to realize that the flu and the way we get it now has been tested so many times, where people sneezed on one another, took their mucus, took a sick person and tried to transfer it. It can't be done. Therefore, the guest we had all those years ago that took so much hell in his home country of Italy for informing us that the flu is best described as electromagnetic vampirism, and it can be tied directly to the onset of radio. You want to add anything before we take a break, Jason?
So lots of changes are going on at this time, and radio absolutely changed culture as we know it, because people could just click the dial and then magical sound comes out. It was quite a thing.
Right. Up to this point, if you wanted the entertainment, you went somewhere. You're exactly right. They'd sit right in their own living room and hit the dial. And, you can look these things up on YouTube too. Go look at how wholesome compared to what we see now those old radio shows were doing. We had not had the family unit broken, and we still had, I guess, moral turpitude is a good way to describe it. Anyhow, we're going to take a break for hour one. So this has been hour one of episode 644. Hour one is free to everybody at crow777radio.com. That is CRROW777radio.com. Members know to log in for the full show. Finally, if you become a member now, you get free solar images. These are the images that I got from my giant solar telescope, and I have put them in a PDF form. Some of them print up 40 or 50 inches or anything in between. So if you come with us for a year, you get 2 or 3, I think. If you just do the month thing, you get 1. But if you get them and print them, please take a picture and send them to us. We'd like to see. Anyhow, members get access to all the forums and comments section. They can create top-level ideas to talk about. They can stream the 2-hour film called Shoot the Moon anytime they please. That has 10 awards in the world, the last 2 coming from India, and that covers all my lunar telescope work, as well as chemtrails and what I'll just call UFOs, as well as all the lunar waves I shot and the first discovery of the so-called second sun. Members of crow777radio.com also get exclusive access to my solar work. I am working on editing the 18th solar member video now. With that, we're going to take a short break, and I'd like to wish you all a happy, healthy, and higher-minded new era. There it is, man. Cheers.
Belief is the enemy of knowing.